All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a figure who really had a grip on early 20th century thought, Benedetto Croce. I mean, philosophy, aesthetics, literary criticism, you name it. And maybe this hits home for our philosophy folks out there, but it's wild how, like, his star kind of dimmed so fast after World War II, you know?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, that shift in his intellectual standing. You got to remember the scene he was coming up in, though, in Italy, real heavy on that empiricist positivism, which was a whole different ball game from, say, the post-Hegelian idealism that had England in its grasp.
Totally. So for you listening, especially if you've like wrestled with questions of art, expression, or even just like the nature of reality itself,
hmm
we're going to really dig into what I think is Croce's most like juicy contribution, his take on art as expression. It's unique to say the least. Our mission here is to kind of unpack this core idea, seeing where it fits in his whole philosophical system, but also trying to appreciate what makes it tick on its own.
To do that, we'll start with the basics, Croce's philosophy of spirit, and see where aesthetics fits into the puzzle. Then we're going to explore his idea of the primacy of the aesthetic. That'll lead us to his main point, which, to be honest, might sound a little weird at first. To intuit is to express. Then we'll trace the implications of this idea for how we understand art, language, and even the work of the critic. And finally, we'll touch on some of the later twists and turns in his thinking and some big criticisms that philosophers have thrown at his theories.
Okay, so before we zero in on art, let's paint a picture of the philosophical world Croce was dealing with. He was trying to find that middle ground between what he saw as the extremes of, on the one hand, transcendentalism, where the world we experience is kind of secondary, and on the other hand, sensationalism, which is all about those like fleeting senses and nothing more. He landed on this idea of immanentism, saying that it's lived human experience that's the real deal concrete, not just some shadow play. Spot on. And from there, Croce built his framework of the four domains of spirit or mind, if you prefer. First up is the aesthetic, all about beauty, and zeroed in on those unique, particular things he calls intuitions. Then comes logic, the realm of truth, working through concepts and universals. The practical side then splits into two. The economic, which is about usefulness and vitality, and the ethical, or moral, guided by the good. What's crucial for us philosophy nerds is that for Croce, the aesthetic is how we first meet the world in all its like raw individuality. It's not just one domain among many. It's the foundation, the ground floor.
So that really lays the groundwork for this primacy of the aesthetic, huh? Sounds like these intuitions carry a lot of weight in Croce's system. Oh, they do. They absolutely do. For Croce, intuitions aren't incomplete or blind, like they don't need concepts to make sense. A pretty big departure from Kant, as some of our philosopher listeners might notice. He says that an intuition is already a full conscious thing in itself, existing before any concept comes along. The only thing we can know about them beforehand is their unique, one-of-a-kind character. He even questions the Kantian idea that they have to be spatial or temporal.
Interesting. So how does this idea of intuition, this foundation, fit into the bigger picture of his thought?
Well, Croce sees these ways of thinking as like levels in a hierarchy. The intellect, the world of judgment, it needs that intuitive mode, the aesthetic, to even exist. Then you have the practical realm, which leads to empirical laws and actions, and that depends on the intellect. And at the top, morality guides the goals of the practical sciences. So for Croce, all mental activity, and really everything we call reality, comes from the aesthetic. And this aesthetic level, it doesn't have its own goals, purposes, concepts, or judgments. It just is.
That's a pretty foundational role for the aesthetic. Even like understanding reality itself hinges on it, it sounds like.
Right. For Croce, take an intuition, add the judgment that it actually exists, boom, that's perception. But the intuition itself, at first, it doesn't have that judgment. He goes on to argue that to say the world is essentially history is to say that deep down, it's all aesthetic experiences woven together, a big story to which we add the idea of reality. He even sees the natural sciences as a little impure in that sense, because concepts like a space-time point are just abstract ideas, not things we experience directly. He calls them pseudo-concepts, coming from our need to do things rather than pure knowledge.
So most of the everyday concepts we use, like house, reptile, tree, he'd lump those in with the pseudo-concepts too.
Exactly. He sees them as just groups or generalizations we make for convenience, not reaching true knowledge like what he calls pure concepts. These pure concepts, things like finality, quality, beauty, they're special because they're expressive, universal, and concrete, and they get that way through what he calls a priori synthesis. He argues that every experience has these three qualities built in. Expressiveness is how the intuition shows itself. Universality is how it makes sense to us, and concreteness is its specific, unique existence.
This is a pretty different way of thinking about concepts than we usually see in philosophy, huh? And you mentioned a difference with how Collingwood and Russell thought about those building blocks of intuition, right?
Yeah, Collingwood, following Russell's lead, saw intuitions as built from sense data, those basic bits of sensory info. But Croce was like, nope, the intuition is one whole, can't break it down. For him, splitting it up into these little sensory pieces is messing with the original. He was on the same page as Frege, about sentences being the real deal in language. Meaning comes from the whole expression, not isolated parts.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork for Croce's system and this central role of the aesthetic. Now, let's get to the heart of it, art as intuition and expression. He says something kind of surprising, that art is, in a way, everywhere.
He does. It's a pretty radical idea. He's saying art isn't locked up in museums or concert halls. For Croce, the difference between an everyday intuition and the kind we get from a work of art is mainly a matter of degree, like how intense and focused it is, not a completely different type of thing. He famously said, there is not a special chemical theory of stones as distinct from mountains. In the same way, there is not a science of lesser intuition as distinct from a science of greater intuition, nor one of ordinary intuition as distinct from artistic intuition. The point is that all intuitions, to some extent, have the same qualities we find in art, just turned up to 11 in artistic intuitions.
That sets the stage for his big idea. To intuit is to express. Now, for a lot of philosophers, that's not going to be obvious right off the bat. What's he getting at with this kind of paradoxical statement?
Yeah, you got to think about it within his idealist framework, where basically everything is in the mind. So for Croce, a work of art is, at its core, a mental thing, an idea, like our thoughts or what we imagine. But he goes further, saying that even if you're hardcore about the mind-body split, the artwork is still mostly mental, living in that active intuition. It's got this double ideality. This kind of echoes some of Russell's stuff about perception being relative to sense data. The artistic qualities we see depend on who's seeing them. So when we talk about them, we're really talking about our own mental experience.
So intuition here isn't just passively taking in information. It's an active mental event, right?
Right. It's forming a representation, imagining, inventing, envisioning, contemplating, not just sitting there and letting stuff hit your senses. And this brings us to a key idea. When someone takes in a work of art, music, poetry, a painting, they're essentially recreating it in their own mind through that same intuitive act.
And how does feeling fit into this? We usually think of art as being tied to emotions.
For Croce, feeling isn't just those big, obvious emotions we sometimes have. He says it's part of all mental activity, even something as basic as seeing. He actually equates feeling with the will in our minds, covering our thoughts, desires, actions, the whole shebang. So the big test for something to be art is how well its expression holds together, how that underlying will moves as one of the intuition. This is why Croce doesn't make a big deal about the traditional form content split in aesthetics. They're inseparable in the act of intuition.
This might answer a question that comes up. What about people who have strong intuitions or feelings but can't express them in a typical artistic way? How can intuition be expression in those cases?
Croce tackles this in a couple of ways. First, he says we often think our everyday intuitions are clearer and more complete than they really are. In the hustle and bustle of life, they're fleeting and fuzzy. He says, the world, which as rule we intuit, is a small thing. It consists of small expressions. It is a medley of light and color. Second, if someone is really focused on something, deeply contemplating an object, let's say that focused attention, that internal shaping of the experience, is itself a kind of expression for Croce, even if it doesn't produce something physical like a painting. He does later refine this, though, suggesting that ordinary perception might lack a certain lyrical quality that's the hallmark of true art.
This brings us to the line Croce draws between artistic expression, which is what aesthetics is all about, and what we might call natural expression, like, say, crying out in pain. He wants to keep these separate, right?
Absolutely. We might think of crying as expressing grief, but Croce says that's not the same as artistic expression. Natural expressions are the stuff of natural science, like Darwin's work on how emotions show up in animals and humans. Artistic expression, on the other hand, is about giving feeling a theoretical form, making it language, song, or a visual form. The key difference is between feeling that's just felt or acted out and feeling that's contemplated and shaped in art. This is what gives art that cathartic power people talk about. And he's wary of works where raw emotion just explodes without this shaping process.
And he's also known for rejecting the idea that pleasure is the goal or defining feature of art, right?
Yeah. Croce doesn't deny that art can be pleasurable and sometimes unpleasant, but he says those feelings come from recognizing aesthetic value beauty in his terms. Pleasure is part of the practical realm for him, the theory of will and desire, not the core of art. Beauty is the fundamental value in aesthetics, just like usefulness is the value in the practical. He says pleasure is much bigger than art, so defining art as what causes pleasure is too broad and misses what makes aesthetic experience unique.
Okay, so if the physical act of creation, the painting, the writing, the performance isn't the artwork itself for Croce, what's its purpose?
For Croce, these physical acts are kind of secondary. They come after the real work of art, which is that internal, expressed intuition. He's not saying a painter could literally create without paint, but that the essence of the artwork is in the mind. The physical act is mainly for two things. Memory, we often need to put the intuition out there to fully grasp or develop it, and communication, so others can have a similar experience.
So the artist's technical skill is basically about bringing that inner intuition into a form that others can connect with.
Exactly. He sees artistic creation as this back and forth between the artist's intuition and their practical skills. If what they make doesn't match the intuition, they'll tweak and adjust. He even defines technique as knowledge at the service of the practical activity directed to producing stimuli to aesthetic reproduction. Indico. The line between expression and communication can get blurry in practice, but he says it's important to keep them separate conceptually. Technique is about communication, not the core of art itself.
This has big implications for how we understand art criticism and the idea of taste, right?
For sure. For Croce, the critic's job isn't to judge technical skill or how the artwork looks on the outside. It's to reproduce or realize the intuition behind it. The critic is basically doing the same thing as the artist, just in reverse. The artist expresses an intuition, the critic tries to have that same intuition in their own mind. Croce admits that critics can mess up because of subjective stuff, but he says taste, the ability to judge art and genius, the ability to create beauty are actually the same thing. The ability to fully grasp intuitions.
So is there an objective standard of taste for Croce?
He thinks there is, but it's based on the intuitive absoluteness of the imagination, not logic or reason. Critics might disagree in practice because of different mental states and external factors, but Croce says historical interpretation can smooth things over time. And importantly, he sees those supposedly negative aesthetic concepts, like ugliness, not as the opposite of beauty, but as less successful or less coherent versions of it.
Now, one of the more unique and maybe controversial things about Croce is how he connects art and language.
Yeah, the subtitle of his first big book, Aesthetic as a Science of Expression and General Linguistic, really drives that home. Croce argues that all art forms, drawing, music, poetry, whatever, are basically languages. And flipping it around, all real language is poetic in how it expresses things. So he says the philosophy of language and the philosophy of art are the same thing at their core.
So it seems like his argument rests on this idea of language being about expression, being a vehicle for intuition, rather than mainly about referring to things in the world.
Precisely. For Croce, if you say something but it doesn't express an intuition, it's not really language in its truest sense. He plays down the referential part of language, focusing on the sentence as a whole, not individual words. He even says that just like you can't perfectly translate a drawing into words, translating languages is always a bit limited, always relative. Interestingly, he sees artworks as based on conventions and historically conditioned, unlike natural signs, which have a more direct, non-arbitrary link to what they signify. This part of his thinking clearly shows the influence of Giambattista Vico, who famously argued that all early language is essentially poetic in nature.
It's interesting that Croce's views seem to change later on, especially about morality's role in art.
You're right. Early on, he kept aesthetics and morality totally separate. Art shouldn't be judged by ethics, it's all about beauty. But by 1917, things got more nuanced. He still saw aesthetic and moral values as distinct, but he started to say that artists need a certain moral sensibility.
But he made it clear that this isn't about artists being good people, right? It's about their ability to perceive and feel moral emotions, to understand the complexity of human actions and motivations.
Exactly. It's about grasping the human condition and its moral aspects. He also shifted emphasis from beauty as the defining feature of good art to lyrical intuition, where feeling is key to unifying and driving the artistic intuition. And later on, he said something pretty cryptic, that real art has a kind of universality, where each genuine artistic representation is both itself and the universe in a single form.
This idea of universality in art sounds fascinating, but also kind of hard to grasp.
It is. Croce was wrestling with how deeply art matters for understanding ourselves, suggesting that it somehow captures the whole human experience in one expression. While in this later phase, he linked form more directly to universality, moving away from his earlier focus on particular feelings, the exact meaning is still open to debate. It echoes, maybe from afar, the Kantian idea of a demand for universality in aesthetic judgments, though Croce doesn't make that connection explicitly. He does say that because art comes before intellect in his framework, the subject-predicate distinction kind of breaks down, which might open the door for this idea of universality.
Now, even with his huge influence, Croce's aesthetics has its critics. What are some of the big philosophical objections to his ideas?
There are a few major ones. One that keeps coming up, especially from Ducasse, is challenging Croce's core idea that intuition equals expression. Just looking at something carefully, no matter how intently, doesn't automatically make art, at least not how we usually understand it. There seems to be a big difference between passively taking something in and actively creating it, between just seeing and drawing, between hearing and playing music.
That makes sense. It's how a lot of people think about art. And this idea that the artwork is basically a private mental thing, that also raises some tricky questions, right?
Yeah, if the artwork is completely the same as a private mental state, that throws a wrench into art criticism, interpretation, and the whole idea of sharing art with others. If my experience of a painting is inherently different from yours and we can't access each other's, then there's no objective work of art, the painting itself, that we can both talk about and compare notes on. This makes agreeing or disagreeing about art logically messy. While it might not be a straight-up contradiction, it's a very isolating view of art, separating it from any shared reality or understanding between people. Bringing back the physical object and its public accessibility, like most art theories do, avoids this issue and allows for shared experience and critical discussion.
And his idea of language as mostly poetic and not referential, that's also been challenged by philosophers of language, right?
Yes. Thinkers like Bosanquet, among others, have pointed out that while language does have expressive qualities and sentences are important, it doesn't mean the referential aspect pointing to things in the world is irrelevant. There needs to be a way to tell the difference between a scientific paper, which clearly tries to describe the world, and a musical tune. And poetry itself often uses both the sound and the meaning of words, not just their expressive qualities. So saying drawings and musical tunes are basically the same kind of language seems like a stretch, ignoring key differences in how they work. While Croce might argue that reference is just a later addition on top of a more basic expressive core, it's a point where his overall philosophical stance leads him to a conclusion that many philosophers of language find unconvincing.
So looking back at Croce's work, even with some of these big philosophical issues, especially equating art with internal intuition and his unusual view of language, what do you think is his most important contribution to aesthetics?
I think his lasting legacy is stressing art as expression and how we connect with art through intuition. That core idea that art starts from an inner vision or feeling trying to get out still resonates. It shows how individual and maybe preconceptual our first encounter with art is and highlights the active role of the mind in creating and appreciating it.
And how would you compare his ideas to someone like Collingwood, who's often seen as following in his footsteps?
Collingwood agreed with Croce that expressive and aesthetic qualities are everywhere in human experience, but he went deeper into where expressive content comes from, focusing on a detailed theory of emotions rather than abstract form or universality. Collingwood also gave a more systematic argument for why art is different from craft, building on but also going beyond Croce's critique of purely technical art theories. And importantly, Collingwood really looked at the audience's role in the artist's creative process, something Croce didn't really touch on.
This has been a really insightful deep dive into the world of Benedetto Croce's aesthetics. It makes you rethink fundamental questions about art and how we experience it. So to leave you, our listener, with something to chew on, if art really lives in that individual act of intuition, like Croce argued, what does that mean for our shared experience and understanding of the art world? Does this focus on individual inner expression end up isolating us in how we appreciate beauty and meaning? Or does it, in a weird way, connect us on a deeper level because we all have that capacity for intuition and expression? It's definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.